Hello friends, welcome to section 6 of the Hard Surface Modeling series. In the last section, we learnt about localizing topology, a modeling technique. In this section, we will learn about orientation and snapping tools, which are modeling tools. Orientations and snapping tools are interconnected and are often used together, so this section will dedicate time to both. This section is simple compared to the last. Take it as an opportunity to sit back, learn some new tools, experiment and improve. Now that we are clear on the classifications, benefits and weaknesses of techniques and tools, we can insert any new methods into this graph, created in the previous section. As a reminder, we learned that tools are just pre-made functions, simplifying techniques like localizing topology into a process that automatically adds diagonal edges into faces. With this knowledge of tools and techniques, if I place orientation and snapping tools under the tool classification, I can match it with a corresponding technique that the tools have built in as pre-made functions. In this case, the corresponding techniques is coordinate geometry. Let me explain. In the early days of 3D modeling, computer programmers had to manually place each vertex and manually change the positions of each vertex in a model to give the illusion of animation. Nowadays, when we model, we barely ever need to look at the exact coordinates of each vertex. We are able to freely add, manipulate and precisely position vertices without needing to manually input values into these fields here. The reason we can precisely manipulate complex meshes in modern 3D softwares is largely due to orientation and snapping tools. Remember, like all other techniques, understanding and using coordinate geometry can be more complex and time-consuming, but knowing how to balance your use of techniques and tools interchangeably will lead to the best results. Let's look at some examples, starting simple and quickly making our way to advanced tools. Feel free to skip ahead using the timestamps if you are already confident with the basic tools. All the orientation tools are stored in this tab, or in a pie menu accessible by holding the comma key. The default orientation is global, which means that all your transformations will follow these X, Y, and Z axes, regardless of the rotation of your objects. The global orientation is objective and can't change. The local orientation is subjective. The X, Y, and Z axes change depending to the rotation of each object. For this object, which has no rotation, the local and global orientations would be identical. However, for this object, which has some random rotation, the local orientation is affected. Remember that only rotations in object mode affect orientation. If I rotate this object in edit mode, even with local orientation, the orientation stays default. This is super important to remember. Local orientation only reacts to rotations in object mode, not edit mode. Next is the normal orientation. This uses the normal of each face as the Z-axis and perpendicular axis for the X and Y. This is a great tool to use in place for the local orientation, in a situation we just discussed, where there is no rotation in object mode, but the model is in an awkward orientation. If you ever want to see the normals pointing out from faces, edges or vertices, there are options for that in the Mesh Edit Mode overlays. The rest of the default orientation options have much more niche use cases. I personally have never found use for the gimbal, view, cursor, or parent options, but let's go through them quickly. If you activate the rotation gimbal and set the orientation to gimbal, you can see that rather than just acting as a visual tool to help us rotate our object, it actually rotates itself according to our input. The view option sets the rotation of our view as the orientation. If we move around the cube, the gimbal shows us that the orientation of the axis is tracking us. The cursor option sets the rotation of the 3D cursor as the orientation. The relatively new parent orientation is complex, but you might find some use in it. If I add two cubes, rotate one, and then make the default cube the child of the rotated cube, you can see the child adopts the rotation of its parent. Meanwhile, the parent has gone back to a default orientation, as it has no parent of its own to copy the orientation of. Finally, the custom orientation tool, the most advanced orientation tool. It is often overlooked, but I have found immense use in it when hard surface modeling. This one works by selecting a face and then clicking this plus button. It has now stored the normal orientation of this face as a custom orientation, which means I can grab other faces and translate them based off of this face's normal. There is one other tool that pairs extremely well with orientation tools. If you go to the Object menu, under the Transform tab, there is an option to align transform orientation. I highly suggest you bind this to a custom shortcut, as it is something you might be using often when modeling, and it is a hassle to reach through the menus. It essentially takes the selected object or geometry and aligns its orientation to whatever orientation you have set in this tab. For example, if I select this cube and then this rotated cube, whilst having a local orientation, the Align Transform Orientation tool will rotate all selected objects to the highlighted object's orientation. If I switch the orientation to View and perform the tool, the objects rotate to face me. I can switch the orientation back to Global and perform the tool, and the object's rotations are removed. Pairing this tool with the Custom Orientation tool creates a versatile workflow, allowing you to essentially align anything to anything, coming in to save us in situations when local or normal orientations can't fix our problems. Let me show you a very common situation in hard surface modeling which will display how we can use advanced orientation tools with the Align Transform tool. Here I have a sphere, and I want to cut this plus-shaped object into these faces. The problem is, the sphere has some rotation applied to it. There are a few ways to do this. The method I like to use is selecting these faces and saving their normal as a custom orientation. I will also place the 3D cursor in the center of the faces. Now I can take my plus-shaped cutter, move it to the 3D cursor's location, and use the Align Transform tool, which will align the cutter to match the stored normal orientation. Now I can resize and rotate my cutter to fit, perform the boolean and clean up the edges. Whenever you are dealing with objects that have applied rotation, or in any scenario in which you need to align objects or faces, consider using the orientation tools at your disposal. Now let's move on to snapping tools. I am using the upgraded, more advanced snapping tool system introduced with Blender 4.0. As you can imagine, when making precise models like robots and machinery, snapping is essential, not only to create accurate models, but to speed up your workflow. Rather than having to input locations for each vertex, we can use snapping tools to efficiently position geometry or even entire objects. The first snapping option is Increment. When active, all transformations snap to the grid. All snapping tools can be activated by holding the Control key during transformations, and if snapping is already active, holding the Control key disables it. The next three options, Vertex, Edge, and Face snapping, allow snapping to the respective geometry. Just like with orientation tools, snapping tools can be useful when working on meshes in edit mode, as well as when placing objects in object mode. Vertex snapping is the most commonly used of all snapping tools when working on hard surface models. The volume option allows you to snap anywhere within the volume of a mesh. And the edge center and perpendicular options allow you to snap to edge midpoints, or the nearest point on an edge. The extra options are all more or less self-explanatory, but if you need more information, don't hesitate to check their functions in the Blender manual. With Blender 4.0's revamp of the snapping tools, a new layer of depth was added, which renders most snapping tools obsolete with how powerful it is. The snap base function allows you to set a snap from and snap to point. For example, if I want to stack these cubes, I press the G key to grab it, and then activate the snap base function by pressing the B key. An overlay pops up around my cursor, which I can use to select vertices, edge midpoints, or any other point on the surface of my mesh. Once I select a point to snap from, I need to select a point to snap to. In this case, I will select one of the top vertices of the other cube. For this reason, I suggest you leave your default snapping tool on Vertex. The snap base tool will be your primary snapping option, but for simpler situations, you can fall back on the Vertex snap. These two tools should cover almost all scenarios. This takes some practice to use fluently, but once you are confident with it, you will realize the snap base tool is a mix of most snapping options we have gone over. This tool is so powerful, I expect that in the near future, the Blender team will reintroduce the snapping menu, removing most functions that will be merged into the snap base function. They might even merge the orientation and snapping tools into one tab and one pie menu. Let's look at some more complex use cases for snapping tools. In the last video, we learned about localizing topology, but you might have noticed that when we performed localizations, we were working in free form, resulting in unprofessional-looking crooked edges. You could specify your cut axis by pressing X, Y, or Z whilst cutting, but that still isn't accurate when trying to align vertices. Instead, we can use snapping tools to quickly rectify those edges. I can scale both these vertices to 0 on the Y-axis, then take each vertex and move it on the G-axis, holding Ctrl to use the vertex snapping, and snapping each one to their respective connected vertex. Now let's say I wanted to duplicate and flip this mesh on the X-axis. With the snap base function, this is easy. Duplicate the mesh and rotate it 180 degrees on the Z-axis to flip it. Press the G key to move it, then the B key to activate the snap base function. You can select any of these vertices and snap them to the matching vertex on the other plane. Merge by distance, and there we have it. You might need to recalculate the normals, so press Shift+N. Now what if I have this object here which has a random rotation applied to it, which I need to slot this object into? Well, I can save the normal of this face, place the 3D cursor there, and move this object to that position, and use the Align Transform tool. It's not quite right, but it is easy to edit since we are working in the custom orientation. I can even use the Snap Base tool to make sure the object is perfectly slotted in. Implementing orientation, snapping, coordinate geometry, and the 3D cursor into your workflow will boost your efficiency. However, it is a lot of new tools to learn. It will take a lot of practice until they become ingrained in your workflow. I encourage you to experiment with them. Now that we have completed this section, we have the knowledge of all the essential hard surface modeling required. In the next section, we will look at how we can use curves in our workflow, before finally moving on to some modeling practices. See you there. Remember to like and subscribe for more, and comment any thoughts or questions.